here's the cycle. You wake up in the morning, you're feeling really crap. Yeah. Your nose is running, you're struggling to breathe, walking feels like you're walking through treacle. Yeah. You get out of bed, you put on your clothes, you head out the door, you get to Pearly Way, come hell or high water, you sit down and you earn the first 10 quid or 15 quid, whatever is necessary for you to be able to call a dealer and go and get your 101. A little hit of white and a little hit of dark. Rinse and repeat. I was born in Kenya, in Nairobi, in 1962. My parents were both born in England. My dad in Beckenham, my mum in Amersham. During the early 50s, my father went out to Kenya to join the Kenya police. This was at a time when Kenya was still a British colony, but there were uprisings, and the most famous of them was the Mau Mau, MAU, Mau Mau uprising. And my mother went out to Kenya on holiday, liked it so much that she decided to stay, got a job working in a hotel, and they met, got married, and moved to a suburb called Langata in Nairobi. They also lived in a suburb called Karen, which is what my younger sister is named after. I was born. My middle sister is 2 years younger than me. She was born in Nairobi. By 1966, Kenya had got its independence. Kenyatta had come into power. They were uncertain as to what the future would hold, so they returned to England. My dad was 35. Basically stayed there for 6 months. He couldn't get a job. My mother hated being back in England, hated the cold. So they decided to move back to Africa. My dad came first, moved to South Africa, got a job, and 6 months later, my heavily pregnant mother and myself and my middle sister sailed on the Union Castle to Durban. And so we moved to South Africa. I was duly put down on a waiting list for one of the top private schools in South Africa, where I went when I was 13 as a boarder. My sisters went to the local girls' high school, which was a continuation of the schools that the primary schools. I was not at all sporty. I was classic little nerd. I was bullied extensively, not only at high school, all the way through my schooling. But I found ways to circumvent So, for example, I used to do first aid, and I did first aid for the rugby matches. And South Africa, as you know, is rugby mad. By the time it came to the last 2 years of school, I had become the honorary first aider for the first team rugby, which meant that I got to go on some of the rugby tours. I became a member of the team. So as opposed to being the nerd completely rejected by these the 15 top guys in the school, I was now a part of that. At the end of my third, so when I was 16, end of my third last year at school, um, I happened to do exceptionally well in the end of year exams. So the following year, they set about doing IQ tests and aptitude tests and personality tests and all the rest of it. And it turned out I had an IQ of about 182. The aptitude test basically came back and said that I could do anything I wanted, um, and I would probably succeed. And off I went to university. I went down to Cape Town University um, to study actuarial science. One term in my first year, I was living in residence, and there was a loud explosion on from somewhere down the corridor um, that my room was on. So I went to investigate. And in one of the rooms, there was a young man whose father was a missionary in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, and um, his son came to and he was an amateur chemist, and he had made some touch powder, and he had a little jar of this touch, stuff that you throw on the ground and go kind of explodes. He had a jar of it on his shelf, and he knocked it off, and it exploded. It blew his tape recorder into the wall. Luckily, didn't damage the Apple II computer. About the only boy in the university who had an Apple computer. Anyway, so he had this Apple computer. He also smoked weed. And at that point, I had drunk very little. I had never touched drugs. Yeah, I started smoking weed. How old are you? I was 18. When I was about 23, my father hadn't seen me for a couple of weeks. He came looking for me, and I was living in a flat. Um, uh, uh, I had a room in a friend's flat, and he found me in my room, naked, sitting on a mattress on the floor, curled up, all fetal, um, not particularly well. Took me to the family GP, who booked me into the local psychiatric unit. Basically, they put me to sleep for a couple of weeks. Yeah. In South Africa, the weed has digitalis, the stuff found in foxgloves, the stuff used for heart medications. But when taken in excess, it can cause psychosis. So I was effectively toxic psychosis. Anyway, I don't remember much of the time I was there, other than doing some art and stuff. But I must have had a number of meetings with psychiatrists, psychologists, whoever. At the end of it, I came away with a little letter saying that I probably had borderline personality disorder. As a British citizen with permanent resident status in South Africa, we were we, we bypassed the conscription that all South African men had to do at the time. But the wars were not going well for South Africa, and so they changed the rules that meant that people like myself were now eligible to be called up for the army. And I got call-up papers for the tank division in Kimberley, and I could not picture myself in a tank. And so myself, along with about 30 other people of British origins, all immigrated to the UK in 1985. We all arrived in Hackney. Um, uh, most of the people were living in squats. A few of us lived in rented accommodation, and for the next roughly call it a year, um, we lived in Hackney. Um, those of us that worked during the day. Most of them didn't. In the evenings, we sat and drank beer and smoked weed. Probably time to do about boyfriend number one. In 1987, I met a boy called Paul, um, and we spent the next decade together. 3 years into the relationship, an ex-boyfriend of his got hold of him to say that he had had an HIV test and was HIV positive, and he suggested that Paul and I should get tested. We went up to St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington to have the tests, and in those days, it took about a week uh, before you got your results. A week later, we went back for our results. He went in the morning, I went in the afternoon. This was in the day before mobile phones. I got my results. I was negative. I went across the road to the off license there, bought a bottle of champagne, found a telephone box, called home, and said, I'm on my way home. I've got some champagne. He said, why? I said, well, I'm negative. And of course, I'd assumed that because I was, he would be. And he wasn't. He was HIV positive. And it took him 7 years to die. This was in the days before the modern ARVs. And though they had a number of drugs, they obviously had drugs uh, to treat the secondary infections like pneumonia and thrush and all the rest of it. But they also had a handful of drugs um, that that were able to fight the virus to a certain extent. Yeah, but ultimately they would fail. Yeah, and the immune system would carry on deteriorating. Um, and yeah, come 1997, he weighed about 38 kilograms. He could barely eat or drink because he had thrush all the way through his esophagus. Um, he had had pneumonia 6 or 7 times. Um, it was horrible. He uh, had diarrhea. He vomited. Uh, Almost every night, I would have to carry him downstairs to the bathroom, clean him up, um, clean all the bedding, put him back to bed. By the time he died in 1997, it was a relief, frankly, for him and for everyone else. Um, yeah. I flew over to Dublin, east to Cork. I had a week of training at one of our customers, and I arrived um, at their offices on the Monday morning, only to find that they'd got their dates wrong and they weren't expecting me for a week. So I phoned back to London and they organized a flight out for me that afternoon. I got a phone call in the morning from my boyfriend's ex-partner to say that Paul had been taken ill and was in St. Mary's with pneumonia. So I arrived back in London, uh, Gatwick or Heathrow, I can't remember, and I travelled straight to the hospital. Um, he'd just been admitted. The nurses said that if I wanted, I could stay and spend the night there. Paul assured me that everything was going to be fine. Um, go home, get some rest, come back in the morning. At 12:30 that night, I got a phone call from the hospital. Um, I didn't know it, but Paul had listed me as his next of kin, and he had suffered a heart attack, was on a life support system, and I needed to get up there as quickly as possible. So I did, and he was unconscious on this machine. Um, I sat with him for several hours, um, and then they said, I need to make the decision to turn off the machine. Um, so I did. And then I called his family. Um, went to the funeral. I was absolutely numb. I could not cry. I didn't know what to feel. Numb. In August '97, Diana died. And a week later, whatever it was, I had the funeral. You probably remember it. I sobbed my heart out. It just floods. Mm. About 6 months after he died, at that point, I owned a house in Croydon. About 6 months after he died, I met a young guy up in Croydon, straight guy. Turned out he lived round the block from me with his girlfriend and 2 kids. And we hit it off. We took speed, lots of it. We watched pornography. And every time I was in London, this was at the height of my traveling. So I'm out of the country the bulk of the time. Whenever I was back in London, 5 minutes after I arrived home from some trip, Sean would be at the door, and he would stay in my house until I packed my bags and headed off for the next flight. In 2002, I got really, just after I moved back to South Africa, I got really, really ill. Diarrhea, lost weight, not all well. Christmas of 2002, my parents came up from the town that they'd retired to spend Christmas with me, and I'd invited this girl from the office to spend Christmas with us. I was so ill, I spent the entire day in the bathroom vomiting and diarrhea. My dad took over the cooking of the food. Um, by then, I'd been to my GP a couple of times. He was flummoxed. He had referred me to a specialist, which I was due to meet that week. I remember my mother came into my room. She sat on the bed. My parents, of course, knew about Paul. They knew what he died of. My mother said, "Do you think it could be that?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, sure you'll be okay. Love you." Gave me a hug. I saw the specialist the following week. He suggested I go and have HIV tests. I did. I was positive. I ended up in a hospital in Johannesburg. The doctor walks in. as kids, my sisters and I, as I told you, went to these two junior schools, and they then went to the girls' school. There were three sisters in a family: Fiona, Francesca, and Rosalie. Uh, Fiona became a lawyer, Francesca became a doctor, Rosalie became a famous author. Um, Francesca became an expert in HIV and was responsible for the rollout of the HIV program in Botswana. She also became my doctor. She said, "Take this medicine and you'll be okay." And I was. And so for the next 22 years, well, from then until now, I've been on ARVs. Yeah. Um, and of course, on that journey and with my online presence on sites like Gaydar, I spent more time talking to people about their fears that they might have HIV, that they have got HIV, they don't know what to do about ARVs, etc., etc. And I talk them through in my experience. Um, and when Paul died, um, I lived in a house just off Sydenham Road, and round the corner was a pub called the Bird and Hand. The Bird and Hand was a family pub that was gay friendly. So it had this weird mix of families and this gay crowd. And this was in the 80s, late 80s and 90s. And Paul and I, and my best mate Kenny, who I shared the house with, and his boyfriend Paul, we drank in the Bird and Hand for several years. And over those years, various gay guys who went to the pub would start getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And then one evening they would arrive in a wheelchair, and a couple of months later we'd go to their funeral. Probably about 10 of them over the years. The final one being Paul. This was at a time when the Sun newspaper was suggesting that all homosexuals should be put in concentration camps so that they couldn't contaminate the rest of society. In 2005, I met someone online, and by 2007, we got married. My mother, her father had been a builder in Amersham Bucks, and had built a whole load of houses and shops with flats above them and what have you. And these properties were inherited by my mother and her sister. And the rental income from those properties paid for my private school education, paid for my cousin's private education, paid for our holidays and all that kind of stuff. Sold off those properties, and I used the money to buy two houses in Johannesburg with my newly acquired husband, and converted it into a 12-room guest house. And for the next 10 years, we ran the guest house while I also continued in my programming career. That then led to a job at a company called Track in Australia. I went for an interview with the company in Sydney. It was perfunctory. It was basically to tick the boxes for HR, but I already had the job. And the CEO of the company said, "If you want to move to Australia, just let us know." And Australia is absolutely fabulous country, and I would have moved the next day. I called home that night to tell my husband, and he said, "Over my dead body." he was not going to leave South Africa because how could he go and live in a country that were our enemies in rugby? Uh, so I stayed in South Africa, a decision that I regret to this day. Husband turned out to be a sociopath, an alcoholic, and a drug addict. Um, I hadn't known that he'd been in AA for 5 years and NA for 5 years when I met him, and he had used the uh, 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 me coming into his life and him being able to move out of his parents' place into my life to uh, resume those um, passions. And yeah, so we did a lot of drugs. He drank an awful lot. Um, the guest house was extremely successful. My career was extremely successful. Um, it was great until we started, um, thanks to the drugs, um, started turning in on ourselves. And so increasingly, we remained locked away in our private residence, um, taking lots of drugs and fighting. And so the uh, relationship eventually um, failed. In about 2010, we had a handyman who did odd jobs around the guest house. He had a young nephew, um, and he introduced the nephew into our guest house. And they used to come over and play poker in our conference center. Um, Husband had fallen madly in love with him, thought he was the best thing since sliced bread, made an absolute fool of himself chasing after this boy. All of our friends and friends of his who'd known him for a decade were horrified as to what was going on. Greg didn't give a toss. Eventually, after about 3 months or so, he took JC out for an evening in the local shopping um, area and declared his undying love. Whereupon JC turned around and said, "What the hell are you talking about? Um, um, I'm your employee. You know? What the fuck?" Greg was a problem. Greg would, at that point, had moved on to crystal meth, um, and he would be high as a kite. He would go out into the guest house grounds naked, start hugging trees or haranguing guests or whatever. And we would have to get him back indoors. I'd been doing crystal meth with Greg. We'd also been doing another drug called CATS, which is effectively an amphetamine speed. So we'd started off on that, but we had moved on to crystal meth as well. We also took MDMA, ecstasy, and various forms of MDMA. Yeah. 2000, so 2012, I got the job in Australia. I did that for 4 years, and left. And contemplated my navel for a couple of months, and then I got a call from a guy who'd been told about me, and he asked me if I would like to write some software for a prototype um, thing that they were doing, um, uh, putting in pharmacy robotics into government hospital pharmacies. Did that for 4 years and got headhunted again. This time to go work for a company in Cape Town. I'd known the CEO of the company for about 20 years. In fact, I trained him as a junior programmer some 20 odd years before I went to work for him. 2019, I arrived in Cape Town. Cape Town is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. A month after I got there, JC joined me. JC and I had become uh, a relationship along the way. He's 30 years younger than me. He came down. We lived in this fabulous penthouse flat for the first 6 months, and then rented a house very close to where I worked, and we moved in there just as COVID lockdowns hit. So I'd managed to show him some of the sights of Cape Town before everything went into shutdown. So I stayed indoors and I programmed. He went out every day and scored his heroin. By watching him smoke his heroin every day, and found myself kind of a bit jealous, really. So one day I said, I want some of that. This was a drug that I had spent my entire adult life avoiding. Remember I told you how when I moved to England with all those South Africans and we smoked weed and drank beer? Well, just as I was moving out of Hackney to my first flat in Camberwell Green, half of those people started using heroin. 20 years later, I was in Cape Town and I ran into one of these people and I said, how's so-and-so? Dead. How's so-and-so? Dead. How's your girlfriend? Dead. I knew that I'd better stay well away from this drug. And so I did. I avoided it for the next however many years, 30 years, until COVID. So for the next 3 years, I worked, and Jesse and I did cocaine, smoked weed, and once in a while, a little bit of meth. In 2020, COVID lockdown shuts down the guest house for the next 2 years. Jesse and I returned from Cape Town beginning of 2022. It had not been operational for 2 years. Bills had not been paid. The water had been cut off. Electricity cut off. Two little junkie brothers that Greg had befriended had stripped the house of all copper wiring, burnt it to remove all the plastic, and then sold the resultant copper wiring to scrap merchants. A friend of mine in the UK who runs a contracting company where they put programmers out to different sites invited me over to the UK for a year's contract to go and work on site at Slaughter and May law firm, where I had written some of their in-house software 30 years previously. They needed to understand how some of it worked. So I came back reluctantly. I left behind JC and Greg, my cats, all of my possessions in some lockup somewhere down in Cape Town. Everything I had collected, painted, left it all behind. Got back to Croydon. I came back to Croydon because this is where I'd lived for 15 years, from 85 to 2002. and got back to find that all the friends that I had in Croydon had either moved on or died, or both. I was alone. For the first time in my adult life, I was utterly alone. I have ADHD, which means that I um, I'm kind of brilliant at a number of things. I can hyper focus, whether it's doing an oil painting or programming or looking after my orchids or um, whatever else I'm involved in. Um, I hyper focus for 14 hours or more. Um, and I'm brilliant. But ask me to do admin work or pay bills or that kind of stuff. And these are simple tasks, utterly simple, but they overwhelm me, and I procrastinate. Yeah, and they don't get done until it's red letters start coming through the door, etc. The people around me, i.e., the boyfriends or husband, and a couple of very close friends, understand this, and they would handle all of that stuff for me. You know, so while I went off and uh, went about being brilliant and earning huge amounts of money, which supported all of them and a buckload of others, they took care of the day-to-day stuff. They fed me, watered me, paid the bills, did the paperwork. Yeah. So here I am, sat in a flat in Park Street in Croydon, utterly alone. My landlord is on my case for 3 months about reading the electricity meter and sending in the numbers to the electricity company. 3 months. Eventually, one day, I followed the instructions, hooked up to the app or web page on my phone, tapped in the numbers, whammo, done. It took me 2.5 minutes. Yeah, done. It took me 3 months to get to that point. Yeah, I was miserable as fuck. Excuse the language. I used to go walking around Croydon, and there was this young homeless guy used to beg outside McDonald's in the pedestrian by entrance to Whitgift. And something about him I liked. I gave him cigarettes, I gave him money, bought him food, got chatting with him, cooked food at home, invited him back to come have a meal, invited him back to come have a bath, invited him back to stay over on the sofa. And so I arrived back in November 22. I met him, I guess, January or so, 23. By May of 23, he'd moved into my flat. He slept on the one sofa. I moved out of my bedroom onto the other sofa. And for the next 6 months, basically until the lease on the flat ran out, that was our living arrangement. I only had to go into the office 1 day a week, and the other 4 days I could work from home. So I'm hooked up via the internet into the office systems, doing what I have to do. And at some point I'd asked Kieran if he could get some weed. And the little bag of weed actually only cost 10 quid, and the other 10 quid was being spent on something else. I knew he had to be on something. He had spots on his face and stuff. I thought it was meth. He swore blind it wasn't. And somewhere along the line, we got talking about heroin and crack, and how they're sold in the streets, and you know, little wraps that they get sold on it in. And one day I go into the bathroom and I find this little soggy bit of cling film and Rizzler on the counter. So I hold on to it, and next time I see Kieran, I'm like, "What is this?" Oh, no idea. And about 3 or 4 days later, he said, "Yeah, it was mine. It's heroin. Please get me some." And so I started smoking heroin and crack. The contract came to an end. Slaughter and May, the project at Slaughter and May was winding up. So the contract wasn't renewed. The lease on my flat ran out at the same time. I could probably have got a new job, but I was burnt out. I'd had enough. For about 3 or 4 weeks, I lived in a room of this partially homeless guy, a friend of Kieran's. Worst 4 weeks of my life. Just about a week or so into December, I moved out of his room and moved onto the street. My first night, I had to find somewhere to sleep. I had a couple of blankets, my rucksack, my sleep meds. I've had insomnia my entire life. And I had a bit of food and some cool drink. So I ended up in Queen's Park. There's a kind of wooden structure that you can climb up into, and I think there's a slide. So I climb up there, make my bed, what have you, settle down for the night. My first night on the street. And it started to rain. So I moved to the South Croydon car park underneath the flyover. And I get a phone call from Kieran saying, "Where are you?" So I told him. He said, "Make your way to Purley Way. You'll find me by Aldi." We stepped outside Aldi that night. Then over the next few months, slept in subways, car park by Fairfield Hall, car parks under some flats in Lebanon Road, a couple of bin sheds around Purley Way. I'm now sleeping on the streets with Kieran and Stuart, begging. Streetlink had found me in Lebanon Road. They found me again in a bin shed, and they finally found me again outside Aldi. Eventually, Streetlink found a place for me in a temporary hotel opposite Mayday Hospital. And I moved in there for about 6 weeks, whereupon they found me a place at Palmer House. Palmer House is assisted living. You can stay there for up to 2 years. Um, they get you back on your feet. They engage with CGL if you've got drug issues, AA if you've got alcohol issues. Um, they help you with GPs and healthcare professionals if you need them. Um, I engaged with CGL at one point. Um, Realized that all this fear and angst about giving up heroin, the withdrawal symptoms, and all the rest of it um, was frankly overblown. To be fair, I'm not injecting the stuff. I smoke very little of it. If I have a habit, it's a very small habit. They put me on um, one of these heroin substitutes um, where every day you have to go into a chemist and they give you some tablets and you put them under your tongue. I did that for 3 days. On the Saturday, it was my birthday and I woke up too late to get to the chemist. And on Saturdays, they give you the meds for the Saturday and Sunday. So I missed 2 days. On the Monday, I didn't bother going back. On the Wednesday, I went back to CGL, met with the doctor, told her what had happened. And stopped going. At that point, I knew that it was fairly stupid carrying on smoking. Here's the cycle. You wake up in the morning, you're feeling really crap. Yeah? Your nose is running, you're struggling to breathe, walking feels like you're walking through treacle. Yeah? You get out of bed, you put on your clothes, you head out the door, you get to Pearly Way, come hell or high water, you sit down and you earn the first 10 quid or 15 quid, whatever is necessary for you to be able to call a dealer and go and get your 101. A little hit of white and a little hit of dark. Rinse and repeat. You head back to your spot, you earn the next chunk of money, off you go, do the same. If you're lucky, you make 20 quid or 30 quid or whatever, or that just buys more of them. You sit and smoke all of that and back to your spot. And you do that until about 9 o'clock at night, whereupon, all the shops are closing. Roughly at that time, I head home. If I'm lucky, I get to take home 101 to, take back to my room and smoke those and watch YouTube until about 5 or 6 in the morning when I finally fall asleep. Wake up at 10, off we go again. Becoming homeless can happen to anyone. If you'd asked me at any point in my life if I could ever envisage myself doing anything like that, it was so far removed from who I was, how I'd been brought up, my entire adult life. Not in a million years. I've had several lives in my lifetime, different careers, hobbies that have become money earners. Everything that I've turned my hands to. If I can read a book about it, I can try it out. And one of three things is going to happen. Either I do it for a while and realize I either not enjoying it or I'm not particularly good at it, move on. Or, it's quite fun. I'm quite enjoying it. I'm okay at it. It's a hobby. And it will remain a hobby ad infinitum. Or I'm brilliant at it. In which case I will run with it. At the moment, I sit outside Little doing my paintings. People tell me, what a waste of talent. Why aren't you selling your stuff in the market? Why aren't you online? Well, That's this year. Yeah. This year, the heroin goes out the door. Get out of that cycle. I've started building my Instagram page. Uh, no, not yet. But I will. Uh, and I want to get some of my designs printed onto some clothing. Just one garment with a design, and go online and see if people buy them. And as they buy them, I get them printed and shipped. I'd ideally like to go back to painting oil paintings. I haven't got them on this phone, but once I restore all my Google stuff on this phone, I will show you, if you're interested, some of the oil paintings I did over a 10-year period. I suspect, given the longevity in my family, that I'm probably going to be around for another 20 years. And I really don't want to spend the next 20 years being bored or doing nothing.